Hi, everyone. It's Rob Gray from ASU and the Perception Action Podcast again, back with another article review. In this one, I want to look at the issue of interference, right? And in particular, try to put an ecological spin on this well-known and well-studied phenomenon. So we know from a lot of research, and I talked about this way back in episode 19, that we can get interference when we're learning motor tasks, right? So the idea here, we're learning task A, we practice it for a while, and then we're automatically switched to practicing task B, and then we go back to practicing task A. And interference can occur when practicing B in the middle there makes us worse at learning A compared to a group that did something else or didn't train on task B at all. An example that I talked about back in that episode and is for example, there's research showing that, for example, training for a triathlon can cause interference with improvements in cycling, right? Doing the running and transition from running to biking as compared to people that just practice cycling. And there's also lots of cognitive ones and things shown like that. So this idea of interference, and this is called retrograde or retroactive interference. And traditionally, interference in terms of it is conceptualized in a very information processing view. The idea here is that after I stop practicing task A, I've developed these proceduralized memories in them that are still consolidating, right? So they're still being formed, they're still being stabilized, and if I do another task B too quickly, this disrupts this consolidation process and disrupts motor learning, right? So what I want to do is look at an example of that in a task today, and go then talk about how this might be looked at in an ecological framework. So, important point to point out is that interference tasks are mostly, despite the example I talked about with the cycling and triathlon, interference tasks are mostly studied in very simple lab tasks, simple degree of freedom tasks. For example, aiming, where there's a transformation where where you move, you shifted 90 degrees, something like that. Force field adaptations and things like that. The main finding that comes out from a lot of this is very similar in a way to kind of the transfer idea, right? What causes interference are tasks which have very similar demands, okay, very similar requirements. And the idea is that the interference is caused because they're using overlapping memory representations. So that's the basic idea. So you don't get interference, for example, with tasks that are, when you move from a rotation task to a force field task, or using a different limb, sometimes you don't get that as well. The question of whether you use whether you get interference between more complex tasks that use multiple degrees of freedom is less studied and is less consistent as actually. For example, research showing things in the topic I'm going to talk about today is balance. Research looking at whether there's interference between learning to balance on a board versus a slack line have shown that there's actually not any interference between those tasks. So what's going on here? How can we kind of scale this up to understanding coordination of more complex tasks? So the study I want to talk about today was recently published in the journal Gait and Posture by Egger and colleagues. And they're looking, as I said, at balance, and they're trying to address why in previous studies like the one I mentioned with the slackline, there's not this interference effect is not found. So that's kind of their main goal. And what they did in their study was they looked, going right into the methods, they used 86 participants and split into 4 training groups. So all of them are going to practice the same, what I'm going to call the primary task of A. And what they did in this task was they had to try to balance on this homemade balance board, right? So they're standing on this board that rocks back and forth, and they have to obviously adjust their center of gravity to keep balanced on this board. So it's a very basic balancing task. And of course, you can get a measure of the deviation of the board from perfectly horizontal as a measure of the performance, right? So you get, and participants were given feedback at the end of kind of each session on how well they did in terms of this, right? So this is the main task that they're training for, right? So the main thing they're trying to learn. And this is what we're going to look at in terms of it being impaired by any interference. The other tasks they did, and I think this is the real strength of the paper, is the choice of these. It really allows to make some interesting conclusions. So they split people into 4 different groups, which depended on the secondary task. This is the task B that they're going to be doing in between, right? So they're going to train on A, the balance board, for a while. Then we're going to make you do this other task for a while. Then you're going to go back to A. So sometimes this is called the A, B, A prime design, right? So you're doing A twice with B stuffed in the middle. And they used the 4 groups. The first group did a postural wobble board task. Okay, so as shown up in the right, instead of using the laboratory balance board, they used a wobble board you can buy, online, like the one shown in the picture. The important point about this, and the authors wanted to, this is obviously they hypothesized would lead to interference because it's involving the same basic task requirements, right? To perform the task, you need to control your center of gravity. And also importantly, it's involving the same muscles, right? And what they did in this study was they actually measured EMG activity, and they showed that the EMG activity involved in their balance board and this wobble board was very similar. In particular, you're using mostly muscles in the lower body. And importantly, that's very different than what you do on a slack line. A slack line, you actually use more muscles in your core and things like that than in the lower body as compared to these tasks. So that was the main kind of interference task. The other 2 tasks they did, what they wanted to do was have the same muscles involved, but a bit basically just different task requirements. So what you're using them in different ways. So one of them they used was a force production task. So basically, you were pushing against something with your legs and tried to generate a ballistic force, right? So you're using the exact same muscles. Again, they measured EMG to show this, but obviously you're not using the muscles to control your center of gravity. They then did a third group did a NP, standing for non-postural here. They did an accuracy task. So basically you were sitting using your feet to control the movement of a cursor on a screen to have it follow a track, right? Have it follow a target, right? So again, same muscles, completely different task requirements though, right? And then the fourth group was a control group that just rested, right, between the two attempts at doing the A task of the lab balance board, right? So as I said, very strong design and choice of control groups. Choice of control groups is always a hard thing to do, right, in motor learning research, but I think this is particularly strong uses. So it allows us to rule out some possibilities. So what did they find? So here's their deviation measure. So this is the performance for task A. Remember, they measured it, but we don't really care how well you did on B, right? We want to know, did the training of B affect A, right? So here's the 4 groups: the wobble board, the 2 tasks where you're using your legs for force production and accuracy, and then the control group. And you could see during this, there were 6 training sessions. They're roughly the same, right, in terms of deviation. There's some differences here. Again, error bars would be nice to be able to see the effects here. This they then did the task B and then rested for 24 hours, and then they measured again on task A. Okay. And the main effect you can see is the only group that is showing an impairment relative to where they were at the end of the training is the group that did the wobble board, right? So they're doing the wobble board in between here, and it's showing impairment, so evidence of interference. Another way they expressed this was the change in performance from the end of training to the retention period, right? So the performance overall from first of all, on the left is showing the acquisition phase, from the change in performance from session 1 to 6. So higher is better here. There you can see everybody is improving. All the groups are improving at the main A task of balancing on the lab board. There's no significant differences between the groups. Here's the performance change from the end of training to retention, where you did the whatever B task you were assigned in between. 0 means there was no effect. Basically, you're doing the same equally well at the task as you did at the end of training. You can see that's true for all 3 groups except the wobble board group. There's a significant decrement in performance because they did, we can presumably because they did the B task. Okay. So again, I think this is nice experimental work. The EMG measurements also, I think, were particularly important. So what they found was that interference was only observed when executing a task that had similar task requirements, right? And use similar muscles, similar body parts, similar degrees of freedom is another way to put it. So it's not just that you're using the same body part, right? When you use the same body part to do force or accuracy, there's no effect. Okay. So that this requirement, this task constraint of having to control gravity seems to be what's the important manifestation of what's causing the interference between the tasks. And they further go on to say that interference occurs when you have similar task constraints, similar task demands, and they perform shortly after. They go on to talk a little bit about the applications of this. In particular, they talk about the implications for therapy. We could also extend this to performance coaching as well. They're showing that if you're going to use blocked practice where you do A then B, which it's standard block practice, you're very likely to get interference. So it'd be much better to use random practice where you're shifting between a wobble board and a balance board and things that then you would less likely to get interference. Right. So again, an interesting study. How do we conceptualize this concept of interference in terms of the ecological approach, right? So as I said, most things when you read about interference between tasks like that, and in the episode, as I discussed, I think this is really relevant for sports. What do your athlete do when they leave practice, right, is important. In general, they're talked about in terms of consolidation of memory, so a very information processing view. I think we can understand it fairly simply in terms of direct learning, right? Jacobs and Michael's direct learning. What we're going to see is this is my prediction, and there's some work by Brett Fagan which supports this, his work on breaking. We're not going to get interference when you just use the same information, right? So if I train you on, kick, stopping a ball with your foot and swinging a tennis racket to hit a ball, I don't think you would get interference, right? Both of those are presumably relying on tau to time the movement, but they're using the information in very different ways. So I would not predict interference. Similarly, and like they showed in the study, I wouldn't predict interference when you're just using the same movement, right? So in the balance study I just talked about, both people are pushing their legs. One is to control balance, one is to control force or accuracy. So just the movement itself, when they're similar, again, you wouldn't expect interference. What you would expect interference to occur is when you have them coupled, information and movement coupled in similar ways. So you've developed similar control laws, right? So when you're using the same information to control the same movement, right? So in the balance task, you're using presumably proprioceptive information and maybe visual information as well from viewing the wall to control movements of the limbs of your lower body to keep your center of gravity, control your center of gravity. So that's kind of the information from the senses, and the parameter you're controlling, your center of gravity, are the same. What's going to be different between those two tasks, balancing on the board and balancing on the wobble board, is calibration, right? And so I think we can understand interference in terms of when you give people two tasks that require very similar information movement control laws, but have different calibrations, that's going to likely cause interference, right? The calibration that you've developed for one is going to likely make it interfere with doing the other, right? And as I said, Brett Fagan has shown this in some of his work on braking, when you give people different brake forces. So they're doing the same braking task, but the calibration is different because the cars have different forces. He's shown that you can get some interference. Although an important point about interference is that over time, people seem to get around this, right? Even if they seem to be able to switch back and forth between both tasks, right? Because they learn separate calibrations for the two different tasks, right? So I think interference, as I said, is an important problem, both theoretically. I think it's an interesting problem and it has important applications, but I think we can understand it in terms of the direct learning and in terms of calibration. Okay, that's it for this review. Thanks again for joining me. And as I have discussed, you can support me at this site here to get bonus content related to the podcast and these videos and help keep them going. So thanks for joining me, and cheers for now.